if you're all in with God, I mean, you are walking with him, you have a relationship with God, you're trusting, your faith is growing with God, or maybe you're kind of leaning into God. You want to go all in with God. I mean, you're still not sure, but you're headed that way. I'm pretty sure that the issue you don't have with God surrounds his ability. Right? You just trust that God is God, that God is powerful and God is strong and that God is present and that God can work in ways that will kind of blow our minds. I mean, again, if you're just all in with God or even leaning into God, you probably haven't ever really, really questioned his ability. More than likely, the issue that you have with God, and maybe the issue that you have with God now or that has really caused you to wander in your spiritual journey, or maybe the issue that you have with God right now that's causing you not to go all in with him, is directly tethered to his activity. What God chooses to do and what he chooses not to do. What God shows up in ways that blows your mind and in ways where he's just not present. It's the things that God says to you in the moments where he just feels so silent. The times where God feels so close and present in your life, and the times where he just feels like, not even that he's distant, that he just feels like he's just not around. You see, for the vast majority of people that are all in with God or leaning into God, or even maybe for you, it's why you're deciding to walk away from God. It has nothing to do with, what you think God's ability is. It has everything to do with, his activity. That God, he's not talking, he's not speaking, he's not working, he's not doing, he's not showing up, he's not, doing what you have anticipated him to do in your life and in other people's lives connected to you. You see, I think about it this way. Think back to when you were a child. You're at the dinner table, you're eating dinner, you save that last piece of broccoli for your last bite, not because it's your favorite bite. You're just trying to get away from eating that last piece of broccoli. Your mom, your dad calls you out and like, eat everything on your plate, so you shove it in your mouth, you down it with water, and then your immediate next question, you know the next question after dinner is consumed. Your next question, or maybe it's after all the dishes were put into the dishwasher, the next question for every child is, hey, mom and dad, can I have, yep, you got it, dessert, right? Dessert is just part of, what you do after dinner. And as soon as you asked your mom or dad, can I have dessert? You as a child immediately had a picture of what dessert was going to look like. It might have been a bit utopian, but still, immediately as you were asking the question, you had the picture of what you wanted for dessert. And just maybe the image of dessert in your mind was something like this. I mean, it's not some small sundae, it was the world's most deluxe sundae. Now, one type of ice cream, but several types of ice cream, hot fudge, chocolate syrup, caramel sauce, you name it. I personally, as a child, I love the maraschino cherries, and I mean, one was never good enough. Like, give me all of them that you possibly could. Rainbow sprinkles, and to push it right over the top, fresh, homemade, you can smell them now. Waffle cones. I mean, there's nothing like a waffle cone that's coming right off of that waffle iron, and just the smell that envelops. Oh, so good. So you ask mom and dad, hey, can I have dessert? And you have this image in mind of what dessert was going to look like. You waited in anticipation for their response. And all of a sudden from the other room, you heard them say, yeah, you can have dessert. Well, immediately you had the follow-up question. The follow-up question simply, what can I have? And again, you know what you want. And you waited for them to tell you what you could have. And then you heard your mom's voice. You heard your dad's voice say, tonight, why don't you have a fruit cup. A fruit cup, that's not dessert. And your anticipation for what dessert was going to look like, well, in a moment, completely shifted. Now, I know for me over the years, going from childhood into an adult, well, my definition of dessert has shifted, well, quite a bit. You see, just last week, I'm trying to make some healthier decisions in my life, and so I wanted ice cream. I desperately wanted ice cream, but I wanted something a little healthier. So I got some frozen bananas that I had in my freezer. I put them in a blender. I put a splash of coconut milk, a pinch of salt, a little bit of vanilla, and a splash of maple syrup. And I blended it all together. I had these Enjoy Life dark chocolate chips, the healthiest version of dark chocolate you can imagine. I threw a handful into the blender and blended that up, and quickly I had banana ice cream, or what I like to say, I had my dessert, a fruit cup. You see, for all of us, we have an image of what we think is going to happen. We have an image for what we want. But when reality comes in and it looks different, that's where the challenge lies. And that's for so many people, and maybe for you right now in your journey with God, that's what's going on. I mean, you stare at God's ability. I mean, God's ability is all about what he can do, and you don't question his ability. And that sets the tension because you have an image of God's ability, what he can do. And then the conflict comes in is when you ask him to do something, and his activity, what God chooses to do, is a different picture than, than the image you have in your mind, the image of what you want him to do. And that creates so much conflict between you and your relationship with God. In fact, you're considering walking away from God right now. It has nothing to do with, the picture of God's ability, what he can do. It has everything to do with his activity. What you wanted God to do in your life and what God is actually choosing to do in your life are two different images, two different pictures. You see, last week in part one of the series, we were looking at this one story that's going to take us through the entire series. And in part one, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego ended in this moment saying something that, it just reflects this reality. But before we get to what they said, I wanted to quickly recap the story in case maybe you forgot or maybe you missed part one. And so the first part of the story, this is what we looked at, that King Nebuchadnezzar ordered that a statue, an image made of gold, be constructed. It was a 90-foot tall, 9-foot wide, gold-wrapped statue of an image of a god that they worship. And so not only did he order that constructed, he commanded that everyone worship him. So he gathered all the nobles, all the politicians, all the governors, all the people in positions of power and influence together. And he's like, hey, here's my decree. Here's my command. And then guess what happened? Everyone worshiped that gold image. Well, almost everyone. Not Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Well, then some of the Chaldean nobility, they went to the king and they tattled. They told the king what Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego did not do. But you see, for them, it wasn't really about the fact that they didn't fall down and worship. What it was really about was that King Nebuchadnezzar had placed Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in a position of power and influence. You see, the three of them were helping Daniel, who also he was an outsider just like them, help oversee the Chaldean capital city, Babylon. And for these Chaldean nobles, they just could not understand why the king would put outsiders, slaves, people that they conquered their land and brought them in, why the king would have given them that position of power and influence. So they went to the king and told the king, that just enraged the king. And so what does the king do? Well, the king summons in Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. But then the king does something unthinkable, so not king-like. You know what the king does? He extends a second chance to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And this leads to this no matter what moment for the three of them. They looked at the king, the most powerful man in the known world, and they looked at him and knowing that he's giving them a second chance. And they said to the king, hey, king, we know what your decree is. We know what you're commanding. But what we have to let you know is that our God is able, that God has the ability to save us. God has the power to save us, that God can save us, and that God is stronger than you and all of your gods, that God is able. But, king, you have to understand that even if God doesn't, and this has everything to do with God's activity, if God chooses not to, oh, king, we want you to know, we'll never worship your God. We will still worship Yahweh, our God. And this is where we pick up the story today in part 2. Then Nebuchadnezzar was furious with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and his attitude towards them changed. That word attitude literally means that his entire countenance, his entire face changed. If you're a parent, you know those moments, right? You start first like getting frustrated with your kids and your words, the tone of your voice. Well, they're frustrated, but all of a sudden there's a tipping point where your entire face, it changes, and your kids can tell, like, oh no, we crossed the line. And for King Nebuchadnezzar, I mean, everything about him shifted because he was so upset that these three were going against not just his decree. Now he extended a second chance. He extended grace to them. He's like, hey, come on. Just do this one thing for me. And they still stood up to him and said, we're not going to bow to your idol. So the king ordered the furnace heated 7 times. Now, this wasn't a literal 7 times. This was a figure of speech that simply meant that the king ordered that the furnace be heated as hot as humanly possible. He's like, hey, take it up hotter than you can ever have imagined to take up this furnace. And then he said, I commanded the soldiers, some of his strongest soldiers. And I think about this picture, right? All soldiers are, well, they're pretty strong. All soldiers are pretty fierce. All soldiers, well, I personally would never want to go toe-to-toe with a soldier. I mean, would you? So imagine this picture. The king so wanted to make sure that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego died that, well, across all of his armies, he found the strongest, the most fierce, the most elite of all the soldiers, and he wanted to make sure that they were going to be able to handle these 3 politicians, these 3 guys. I mean, here's what we all know some 2,000 years later, right? If you had a soldier and a politician and you put them in a cage fight, I mean, if you're a betting person or not a betting person, who would you put your money on? Yeah, every time, a soldier. Every time we would. But the king wanted to make sure that these 3, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, these 3 politicians, these 3 administrators over Babylon, he wanted to make sure that, well, they were going to die. So he orders them to be tied up. And so Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were tied up. And, well, they went to throw them into the blazing furnace. So these men, wearing the robes, and this is important, this is a detail that, well, we get a glimpse into. I mean, they're fully clothed. I mean, they walked in with their clothes, and now they're tied up, wearing what they wore, walking into meet with the king. And so they're wearing their robes and their trousers and their turbans and other clothes, and they were bound and thrown into the blazing furnace. The king's command was so urgent and the furnace was so hot that the flames of the fire killed the soldiers who took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And these 3 men, firmly tied, fell into the blazing furnace. I mean, there in that moment, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego had to be realizing that something else was going on. I I mean, as they're approaching the furnace, the soldiers that had them firmly in their grasp, I mean, they fall over dead. And probably it was one of those movements where they could feel the heat. And so they were trying to get them close enough to throw them in. And as they were throwing them in, the soldiers just fell over dead because of the blast of the heat from this furnace. And now Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are in the furnace. Well, then King Nebuchadnezzar leaped to his feet in amazement. What he was witnessing, what he was seeing with his own eyes, he couldn't quite comprehend. And so he asked his advisors, weren't there three men? Weren't there three? Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Weren't there just three of them tied up and thrown into the fire? And the advisors were like, yeah, certainly, Your Majesty. There was only three. We saw it too with our own eyes. And then Nebuchadnezzar goes, look, I see four. I see four. I mean, he knew there was only three, but he had to make sure because, again, he couldn't believe what he was seeing. He couldn't believe what he was experiencing. I mean, it was just beyond him. And so he just wanted to make sure he wasn't losing it. And all of his advisors were like, no, yeah. There was three, but now, yeah, there's four. There's four of them. And not only are they in the fire, well, we're told that they're walking around. And I just think this is hilarious. I mean, I don't know what they're walking around doing, but they weren't standing still. I mean, I don't know if they were like doing laps in the furnace. I don't know if they're doing high fives. Like, I don't know, but they were moving around. It was obvious that they were alive and they were unbound and unharmed. The ropes that had them tied up are gone. The fire that killed the soldiers outside the furnace. Well, the fire inside the furnace wasn't touching them. And then the king says, the fourth looks like the son of the gods. That phrase, looks like the son of the gods. The literal translation is, it looks like the appearance of deity. You see, there's been a lot of speculation over time about who this fourth person is. And in fact, if you're in the Jewish faith, the Talmud talks that they think that this fourth was the archangel Gabriel. If you're a Christ follower, maybe you've heard someone say, well, that was Jesus because it said the son of the gods. But remember, King Nebuchadnezzar wasn't a Jew. He didn't believe in the Jewish God. And, well, he definitely wasn't Christian because, well, Jesus hadn't come to the earth in the form of a man yet. For Nebuchadnezzar, he believed in many, many, many gods. And so he was using his religious world kind of view to try to articulate what he was seeing. And what he knew was that this fourth person in there was deity. What he knew was that the fourth person in there was divine. And so then he approached the opening of the blazing furnace. I mean, he didn't get too close. Why? Because he saw where the dead soldiers were, his finest, most elite soldiers that were laying on the ground. He approached to a distance and he shouted, he goes, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out. Come here. You see, what you have to hold on to for Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, the miracle, well, the miracle happened in the fire. You see, if you've heard this story before, maybe it's the first time hearing the story, it's one of these moments where when you know the ending of the story, it's so much easier. Like if you and I knew the complete ending of our stories here in this earth, right? Living life it would look so much different. But they didn't know the end of the story. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, all they knew was they said, hey, our God is able. But even if he doesn't, and guess what? They were bound. The strongest, the most elite soldiers in all of Babylon were escorting them into the fire. What they knew in that moment was they were going to die. They did not expect for them to make it out of the fire. I mean, you wouldn't either, would you? I know I wouldn't. And they had to go into the fire to experience the miracle. I know for me, and probably for you, we don't enjoy the fire, do we? We don't enjoy the difficult times. We don't enjoy navigating through the unforeseen endings. We don't enjoy the moments of life where, what we see in front of us and is scary and filled with what ifs and filled with unknowns. You see, if you're like me, so many times we just want to avoid the fire. But God works in such powerful ways when we lean into him and we follow him, even if that means we're walking into the fire. You see, it's in the fire where God's ability, his power, his strength is truly revealed. You see, God is able. He's able to do immeasurably more. God is able to do things in our lives, through us, in the lives of people around us in ways that sometimes, King Nebuchadnezzar was in amazement. I've seen things of God working in people's lives, in my lives, that just have left me completely amazed. You see, it's the power of prayer. It's why we lean into prayer across all of our churches. We believe in it. We believe in prayer because we believe in God's ability to do the supernatural in people's lives. We believe in God's presence to work in people's lives. We believe that God can heal. We believe that God can restore. We believe that God can do anything. And that's why we lean into prayer. And I tell you, it's been amazing because we have people across all of our campuses praying daily. We have a group of people, it's called the War Room at our DuBois campus, and every Monday they gather together and pray. We have another group of people at our North Central campus that they come together in the evenings and they pray. We have people everywhere praying for people they know, praying for people they don't know. It's why last week in part one, we took a moment in all of our churches just to look at the prayers coming on the prayer wall. You see, what you need to know is last weekend, my phone started to light up. A prayer request. And as a dad, it was one of those prayer requests. You see, this is Scarlett. Scarlett's 3 years old. You see, last weekend, Scarlett was at a birthday party, and it was one of those moments for a mom, for a dad, that's just unthinkable. As all the kids were having fun and playing, Scarlett slipped into a swimming pool. She was found at the bottom of the pool, and for Tom and Bethany, they had no idea how long she had been there. People sprung into action and pulled her out of the pool, started giving her CPR, and they got her as fast as they could to a hospital. And when they got to the hospital, they had no idea how long she'd been under. They had no idea the outcome. If you were looking at the prayer wall last weekend, you had seen Scarlett's name on that prayer wall several times as people were saying, we have to pray, believing in God's ability, believing that God is able to do the miraculous. And we were all praying for Scarlett. We were praying for the doctors to lean into the wisdom that can only come from God. We were praying for all the other medical staff that they would lean into God's wisdom and God's voice that can only come from God. We were praying for God to work a miracle. See, I believe in God's ability. I believe that God can heal, and he does heal. And we were praying for Scarlett. On Wednesday, I got a text of Scarlett standing in the hospital room, and the caption was, "We're going home." You see, I don't question God's power. I don't question God's ability because God is able. And I pray that you hold on. Don't ever let go of God's power. But I also want to encourage you. You can't let go of. Well, you can't let go of what Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego weren't going to let go of when they said, even if he doesn't. You see, miracles. Well, miracles. Happen in the fire. But sometimes those miracles, sometimes the miracle isn't the miracle we expect. And maybe for you, it's why you're walking away from God. Maybe for you, it's why you're considering walking away from God. Maybe for you, the tension in your relationship with God is because, you anticipated what that miracle was going to be. You had the image in your mind of what that miracle was going to look like. You just knew. I mean, you prayed faithfully and prayed specifically for God's ability to show up and work in a very specific way. And God's activity didn't match your image. And that's why the story about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego is a story that you should hold on to. Because they believed in God's ability, but they also believed that just maybe, God's activity wasn't going to line up with their expectation. And that's why they said, even if you don't. You see, some 150 years ago, a dad lost 4 of his kids on a boat traveling from America to Europe. He received a simple message, and he realized that his 4 kids were gone. But instead of walking away from God, instead of leaving God, he leaned in. He got on a boat, and on that journey from America to Europe, as he leaned into the fire, trusting in God, God worked a miracle that was different than I'm sure what he was praying for. I'm sure he was praying that his kids would be found in the ocean, that some boat would have come by and found them and got them. I'm sure as a dad he was praying for that, but that wasn't the miracle God had in store. But for this dad, he leaned in. And the miracle, it's a miracle that keeps touching lives to this day because God put these words on this dad's heart.
When peace like a river attendeth my way, when sorrows like sea billows roll, whatever my lot now has taught me to say, it is well with my soul. 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 is well. And through it all, my eyes are on you, and it is well with me.
You see, sometimes the miracle isn't the miracle that you were expecting, but it is the miracle that God chose. And you see, when we lean into that, we see God work in ways that's beyond us. For over 150 years, that song has moved and touched and encouraged and breathed hope into untold lives. Because a dad leaned into God, rested in the fire, the loss of his 4 kids, and allowed God to write a song within his soul. This week, I received a message from a gal named Trudy. And I asked Trudy, I'm like, Trudy, can I share your story? Because I think her story will encourage you. And this is what she wrote me. She said, your message today was a powerful reminder of one of the no matter what it takes seasons I somehow survived. My husband had familial idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis. No known cause or cure. His lungs hardened. He had been rejected by 2 hospitals for lung transplantation. The 3rd hospital accepted him into the program. He was quickly placed on the waiting list, and our church praised the Lord around the altar, expecting a miracle, as we were told it could take weeks or months. And just a few days later, we were driving into Philadelphia for a doctor's appointment at Temple University Hospital. And we got the call. They had lungs for Lee. Come in immediately. Miracle. We called and texted everyone that needed to know. Family gathered, prayed, and waited all night. Results were not optimal. Damaged lungs from a 20-year-old car accident victim were somewhat deficient. My whatever it takes became I don't understand, but I trust in you, Lord. Lee remained in Temple University Hospital for 3 months, 2 hours from our home, 4 or 5 trips a week. The Lord saw us through the grueling season, kept us safe and our eyes on him. Lee passed away from sepsis. At last, he was able to breathe freely and be with Jesus. I said all of that to say that whatever it takes has shaped my life in a way I never thought possible. The Lord has used that in a ministry that I didn't seek out. Whatever it takes to remain faithful to God in every circumstance is done one step at a time. He is faithful. You see, for Trudy, she helps lead at a grief share where men and women gather together, navigating through loss. You see, for Trudy, the prayer was for her husband to be healed. But the miracle that God has worked in her life is now she's helping people who have lost greatly, like she has lost greatly. See, my encouragement for you is this. Hold on to that God is able. Hold on to a God who is powerful, to a God who is present, to a God who is with you. And as you hold on to a God who is able, hold loosely that, well, maybe he won't work in ways that you anticipate. Maybe the miracle won't be the miracle you're praying for. But just maybe, as you continue to lean into him, that you will see what God is doing in you and through you. And that you will still worship and follow a God who is with you and is for you. God is able. And even if he doesn't, still follow him. Let's pray. Lord, I just thank you for who you are. Lord, I pray for people right now. I ask because I know this is a difficult part of the spiritual journey. So God, I pray that you will just whisper in, speak into hurting hearts right now. That, Lord, your strength is enough for all of us. And that, God, we pray specifically for people, for a miracle, trusting in your ability. But, Lord, we also know that sometimes your miracle looks different than what we're praying for. And so, Lord, we will just continue to worship you. We'll continue to lean into you. We're going to continue to trust in you in all things. In your name I pray.